This podcast is provided with the understanding that it does not constitute professional medical advice. The information presented on this podcast are my own personal views, opinions, and summaries of research. Always consult your physician regarding any medical concerns, conditions, or treatments. Greetings to all, and welcome to another installment of It's Not You, It's Me, a PMDD podcast. I can't believe we're mid-January right now. Like, January is almost over, and oh my god, I'll be getting married in like 2 weeks. Oh, it's getting real. It's getting real. Next time I do an episode, I will be a married woman. It's crazy. Okay, but enough about that, so I don't like start freaking out, like in a good way, but I don't want to make it all about that. To start this episode, I wanted to share some listener notes that I received. So someone on Twitter had sent me a great message with some feedback, some constructive criticism, and questions that I thought would maybe be best responded to via the podcast, because it's hard to tell tone in text, in typing, like if I were to respond via Twitter or to post it somewhere. And then other people might have the same questions, same thoughts, so I thought it would be better to address it on a more broad spectrum. And I love this. I love getting into conversations and hearing different perspectives and ideas. And if you have questions or comments for me, you can send them to me on Twitter, Instagram at PMDD Podcast. You can send them as a voice message using that free Anchor app. And unless you specify it, just out of respect for privacy, I won't address your username or your name associated with your account in case you're worried about like being singled out or anything. And on that note, I would like to thank a recent listener who sent me a voice message through Anchor, letting me know that she was just diagnosed with PMDD and that the podcast has been helpful. And thank you so much for taking the time to send that and to let me know, and to let me know that it's helping. This is what makes me want to keep going at this. But like one super helpful piece of feedback was that the audio had cut out in a previous episode about the ICD and PMDD. Not quite sure what happened there. I went back and re-recorded those pieces, so those should now be working. Should be all good. But so when I say to message me, it's not just solely questions about a topic or something I've reviewed, even helpful things like that, like, hey, the audio's glitchy here, or we can't really hear what you're saying there. Those things are super helpful as well. So this Twitter user, in her message, she said, "You discussed some reader comments, and it wasn't clear to me about what your stance was on whether abusive behavior enacted by someone experiencing PMDD symptoms was acceptable or not." And this is in reference to one of the last episodes. I'd argue that it is unhelpful to suggest that abusive behaviors, even abuses that arise from a mental health issue, aren't as impactful as abuses that originate from someone without a mental health diagnosis. I think that partners who set strong boundaries to not accept verbal, emotional, physical abuse are an asset to those of us coping with PMDD. So to clarify, I feel that any abuse, regardless of where it stems from, is not acceptable. One is not a lesser degree of impact than the other, and some form of intervention should be taken, whether that's involving law enforcement, someone leaving the situation, getting family involved, friends, telling someone, like something needs to happen to stop it. And I also agree that partners who set strong boundaries are an asset. For a partner of someone who has PMDD, no, I don't think it's okay to engage in a shouting match or to physically react, but I think it's okay for them to walk out of a room and to talk, or to wait to talk until things calm down, or even to stay in the room, but remind the other person of those boundaries. And that's probably applicable for any relationship. A person should feel safe enough to say something like, "I don't deserve or appreciate the way you're speaking to me, and I'm open to having a conversation when we've cooled off," or, something like that. Maybe not those exact words. This Twitter user goes on to say, "You touched later on the advice that PMDD is an explanation, not an excuse, and I think this would have been an opportunity to clarify your position." I thought for some time how to respond to this, because sometimes I'm not the best at wording my thoughts, or I think I've conveyed what I wanted to say but haven't really. So I'm going to try my best here. Um, so I feel like an excuse is a way to not take accountability or ownership for an action or something that's said, where an explanation is clarifying why someone behaved a certain way, maybe teaching them or sharing with them something about ourselves. Now, I was trying to think of an example of like what I meant by this, and this is simplifying it. Maybe I'm getting it wrong in trying to express myself, but like say I got a flat I got bleh, I'm getting tongue-tied is what I am. Say I'm late to work because I got a flat tire. I didn't choose for my tire to go flat, but explaining my lateness would maybe sound something like, I knew I had a leak last week, but I didn't have time to make an appointment with the mechanic to get it looked at, so it went flat. So I was aware of the problem with the tire. I'm taking ownership that I was late because I didn't get it fixed when I should have. And maybe that's inviting, as far as like the teaching aspect, maybe that's inviting a person in that maybe my schedule's just overloaded. I don't know. And I guess in trying to apply what I meant by teaching others about PMDD is a way of explaining and not excusing. It's like, yeah, I'll be in a crappy mood. I might snip at you, but I'm not acting that way just to be an asshole. Like, there's a reason. Doesn't mean that it excuses it, but there is an explanation behind it. She goes on to also say that similarly, I disagree with how you presented the argument that if you love someone, wouldn't you love and be there for them no matter what? I think presented as is, it fails to consider the very real challenges of partnering with someone with PMDD and the unique personal limitations of our potential partners. I don't think it's a failing for a partner to acknowledge that they are tired of being a target, or don't think that they're in a place to provide support required by the person with PMDD. Now, I agree. There are very real challenges for partners of PMDDers. We know this as those that experience the PMDD. Like, it's not an easy thing, and there's no denying that. And I don't think it's failing for a person to acknowledge that they've done all they can do. And every person, every relationship is unique and different, and unfortunately, I can only speak from my views and my feelings and my experiences and perspectives. She also goes on to say, I would argue that implying that a partner expressing a personal boundaries is taking the easy way out is also unhealthy for people with PMDD to hear, because it fails to acknowledge that the impact that our illness can have on not just us, but others. So I didn't mean at all to imply that expressing or setting personal boundaries is taking the easy way out, nor did I intend for it to not acknowledge the impact that PMDD has on others around us. Everyone should have personal boundaries, and I think it's a healthy thing to have in all relationships, not just romantic ones. She also says, I did appreciate your sentiment that someone who has had a bad reaction to PMDD can get the hell out. Totally on point. Thank you. Sometimes I reflect back on those reader comments from that book, the one that started as a blog and then turned into a book. Some of those comments will sometimes pop in my head and I start to feel riled up, but whatever. It makes me thankful that I have a partner who's patient with me and listens to me when I explain about my symptoms or what I'm feeling, or gives me the space when I need it. So again, if you have anything you'd like me to know, please share it. I will try to address it as timely as possible. I do apologize. It took me a while to respond to these comments. But I did want to give them some thought and to give my answers, to just be careful what I say and how I say it to convey the ideas that I want to. Does that make sense? I don't know. I'm actually in a PMDD week right now, and brain fog's kind of set a little bit, so I might not be making any sense at all. I don't know. But anyway, let's go ahead and move on. So one thing that had continually stayed in the back of my mind from some of the last readings that I did was this idea of self-silencing. And that was something I really wanted to learn more about, and I was able to find this article that discussed just that. The ideas of self-silencing and self-policing in relation to premenstrual syndromes. I mean, we see it in movies and television where a woman is snapping and raging out, and someone, usually a male, will ask something snarky like, "What, are you on your period?" Like, why? Why? Because that's the only time that we're allowed to be angry and not be happy or in control. It's bullshit. But I mean, we constantly see it in memes and cartoons, like when you're on your period versus when you're not. Hell, I've even shared things like that, but there should be a meme where it's like an upset, irritable person, and it's the same image for when you're on your period versus when you're not. So while this article that I'm about to get into isn't explicitly about PMDD, it does have a tie into premenstrual syndromes. The title of this study is Premenstrual Syndrome and Self-Policing, Ruptures in Self-Silencing Leading to Increased Self-Surveillance and Blaming of the Body. I don't know why these articles sometimes have such long titles that are a mouthful. It was published in 2004 in Social Theory and Health and written by Jane M. Usher from the University of Western Sydney in Australia. And I don't know if it's super important to everyone out there, but I like to know about the subjects of a study, so I thought I would get those details out of the way first. This was an interview-based study among 36 British women and 34 Australian women, averaging about 36 years old. The majority were Caucasian, and they were a mix of middle and working class, though the paper doesn't really go into any details about how those classes were classified. So I don't have details on that. The interviews were conducted as more of a dialogue with the women to explore different topics and feelings that they would bring up in these interviews. And the resulting transcriptions were then analyzed using a method called thematic decomposition, which identifies repeating themes and stories within a conversation. And from there, the researchers were able to identify three main themes. And we're going to get into what these are each individually, but just a quick overview. First theme, premenstrual syndrome as an over-responsibility. Second theme is premenstrual syndrome as a split. Third theme is premenstrual syndrome as a loss of control. Now, before we start really diving into it, I wanted to attempt to explain self-policing in case you had never heard this term before. In 1979, a French philosopher, Michel Foucault, that's Foucault, described it as a newer replacement for external social control. It's an introspective surveillance over and against oneself, and the self-policing is so ingrained in the psyche of Westerners that we do it without even realizing it. It's something that just happens subconsciously. The self-policing of women is intertwined with the constructs of idealized femininity, and that's something I've kind of brought up in a previous episode. Like, there are these social ideologies of how the quote-unquote ideal woman should act and behave, and this includes the ideas of women being the nurturers for others, and thereby self-renunciating their own self in order to feel okay with putting their own needs aside, and also the idea that women are to be responsible, calm, and controlled, like, all the time. And it's based on these ideas that a woman judges herself on that as whether she's good or bad. And in reading parts of this article, I felt like there were some concepts and perspectives I was aware of, but just the way they were worded at times was a little mind-blowing, like, oh my god, that's so right. Like, one accepted truth about women is that they care. Through subjectification, they learn to largely be responsible for the emotional wellness of others. So this emotional nurturing results in an identity that's oriented on others. It's more of a relational than a self identity. And there's an expectation that she will be supportive and nurturing to others, particularly, husbands and children, without that same support and nurturing being reciprocated, which is kind of crappy. And this increases the chance of a woman not doing any self-care and having a poorly defined sense of self because it's given up in the prioritization of the needs of others. Like, it makes me kind of think about my mom. Like, when I would get sick, she'd be there, she'd be caring, she'd do everything. But, when she got a cold, she had to still be up and around, doing laundry, doing what she felt she needed to do, instead of just, maybe resting in bed all day, sleeping, doing what she needed to do to get better. Now, I'm not knocking that in any way, but, it was something that came to mind as I was reading through this. So I'm sure there was barely an explanation, barely anything. I'm not a psychologist or philosopher, and this is my layperson understanding of it. And with that said, the goal of this study and this paper was to argue that the experience of premenstrual uncontrolled distress and anger, and the positioning of those feelings as PMS and labeling oneself as a PMS sufferer, are connected to the self-policing practices. So that's what we're going to get into. So the first major theme that came from this, the premenstrual syndrome as an over-responsibility. In these conversational type interviews with the women, they reported themselves as not wanting to or not being able to provide the care or support they felt they would normally provide for their family when they weren't experiencing premenstrual syndrome. And I think this is feeling commonly expressed by a lot of women at a variety of times, really, but definitely more premenstrually. And I just thought it was really fascinating that the researchers referred to those feelings as a symptom, as feeling over-responsible. And this is one of the reasons why I enjoy doing research about PMDD and menstrual-related things, because they often provide a perspective that I've never thought to consider. So some women self-police themselves by comparing their feelings to this concept of the ideal women set by culture and or society and carried out internally, and they judge their own needs and feelings by that, and attributing it to the physiological effects of premenstruation. And only a few in the study said they practiced self-care during this time, like giving themselves space by going to another room alone. But most report experiencing emotions like anger, frustration, and depression. And one thing that came to mind as I was reading through this was a previous theory that had been mentioned in an earlier article I read, was the pressure cooker theory, meaning like these frustrations and depression that women express premenstrually are present all the time, but are repressed, but released during PMS weeks. But we know it's not just as simple as that to explain PMS emotions. There are changes in hormones and such that affect perceptions and task performance and things during that time. The second theme that came out of this research was the PMS sufferer as being split. It's no surprise that many of the women in these interviews use the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde metaphor. There's, the real person, and then there's the PMS person. Now, this was really interesting to me, and I'm going to paraphrase this as best as I can. But by blaming PMS, women are able to retain their sense of being good. But by doing that, the root causes of the emotions that emerge during PMS are not being addressed. So women self-silence in an attempt to emulate, the good wife, the good woman, being happy all the time and being there for everyone, and everything that's associated with that. What doesn't help is the shame that results from a woman's internalized judgment, and sometimes the external judgment from friends or family, like maybe the joking that is tried to be passed as innocent, like, oh, better stay out of her way, even the dog can sense it. Like, that's not helpful. It's shaming. But as the researchers address, the unreasonable behavior that women were reporting seemed to be, with cause, because when they began looking at their responsibilities, they kind of found, I think, what they felt like was some justification to their frustrations. One example they gave was a participant who has 6 children ranging from ages 6 to 21. Now, I can only imagine the stress and pressure of having kids at all different stages of life and childhood. And this one participant's 14-year-old was pushing boundaries and testing boundaries as teenagers do, but, and anyone would probably be upset if their teenager was constantly breaking curfew, coming home late, but she would be hard on herself for the anger she would express toward her teen premenstrually, and she would feel like she failed to be a good mom. But in contrast, they also found that there were some women who felt relieved and empowered when they, for a lack of a better expression, let it all out. The third theme that emerged in the study was PMS as a loss of control. The premenstrual emotions experienced by women in the study were described as a lack of control and attributed to being caused by the body, hence the menstrual cycle. In a way, I kind of felt like, oh, really? No crap. But by blaming the body, it was like an exoneration from the judgments against a woman's sense of self. And while the discussions of these themes was interesting, I don't think they were really surprising. What was surprising to me was in the discussion and study when the researcher said, quote, drawing on a Western model of mental health, women are using psychiatric terminology, anxiety, depression, PMS, in describing the reactions they experience to their own needs as not being recognized, end quote. And they also concluded that instead of conceptualizing PMS or PMDD as a disorder that, needs a diagnosis and treatment, they argue that PMS is the result of self-policing practices that serve to adhere women to what's regarded as the constructions of femininity. But in examining the root causes of the anger and distress, this self-policing can be interrupted along with the self-blaming to result in less feelings of guilt and shame. So in efforts to help the women in the groups, a woman-centered psychological intervention was done that drew on cognitive behavioral therapy and narrative therapy, which helped to reduce the premenstrual distress. And there was also some sort of self-help pack that they didn't really go into detail about, like what that was compromised of, that helped the women as well. And after both approaches, the women were reported of doing more self-care, reevaluating the roles in the home, like as a family and with their partners, and having a higher likelihood to ask for help and feeling a greater sense of control. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I wish they had gone in a little more in depth of like what these treatments exactly involve, some examples, but it's fine. So I feel that was quite a bit to take in kind of a short amount of time. And like always, from the references used in the paper, I have my highlighted notes of other articles to look into, like power, gender, and the self, and the role of PMDD in the subjectification of women. I'm being so tongue-tied right now. And overall, I felt this study was thought-provoking, and I'm curious what conclusions might have been with a larger, more diverse group of women. Like, what if there still been the same themes and conclusions if, say, they used Chinese and Japanese women in the study, or women from other countries? And I kind of agree with what they were saying, that we self-silence and compare and judge, which leads to a lot of different emotions. I mean, we are our own worst critic, right? But that's definitely not all there is to it. Like, yes, researchers and clinicians should acknowledge the role of this self-policing, but I think in conjunction with the biomedical and psychological explanations in relations to PMS and PMDD, to not just, disregard that. I know one thing for sure, though, is now I'm going to be more self-aware and checking myself in different situations. Like, am I self-silencing right now? Am I doing it? Is it happening? I don't know if that'll change anything for me, but we'll see. And I feel like I still need a little bit more meat as far as what the self-silencing is. So I may do a little more digging on this. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this. And you can share them with me on Twitter. or Instagram at PMDD Podcasts. Message me on the Anchor app or through my site, which does have a new address now. I can't recall if I shared that, but that's podcastpmdd.weebly, WEEBLY.com. And I previously wanted to end my episodes. I remember a time where I wanted to end with a quote, and I felt like this one was appropriate to share given the topic we covered. And I don't know who said it, but we're ending with it today. So this is it. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Gotta let that sink in now. But thanks again for hanging out with me and listening in. I hope you have a great day, and I appreciate you taking the time to give me a listen. Take care.